Many thanks for being invited to say a few words here on the Blitz to the East Belfast Festival. Obviously what I'm going through here would be mainly based on my book and with particular reference to the sections which relate to East Belfast. Before going on to describe the various raids, 4 raids, which took place on Belfast, I want to say something briefly about the levels of preparation for the Blitz and the sort of levels of expectation which people may have had as to whether a Blitz would take place or not. It's obviously well established really that Belfast was underprepared for the Blitz in April 1941. Lord McDermott described it as being less well protected than any other major city or port in the United Kingdom at the time of the Blitz. These are photographs of shelters. The one on the left is of Donegal Square North with the public toilets there. There were similar shelter accommodation in Shaftesbury Square. When the war started, those were the only shelters in Belfast. By the time of the Blitz, there were about 700 of the ones on the right, public communal shelters which held about 50 people. Built by the corporation. Difficulty with them was that, for one thing, there were too few of them. If they'd all been fully occupied at the times of the raids, they'd have held about a quarter of the population of Belfast. Also, the design was poor. There was a design fault. The external walls of the shelters, if they collapsed or gave way, the concrete roof, heavy concrete roof, collapsed on top of the occupants. One correspondent from North Belfast, after the Blitz, wrote to complain to the Lord Mayor about it and said just exactly that. He was from Duncairn Guards. He said when the outside walls gave way, many suffered agony and death. And he went on to say Atlantic Avenue is a good example. At the same time, at the time of the first raids, there were no searchlights in Belfast, there was no smoke screen. There were other, however, preparations. On the left here you have the balloon barrage. This was taken September 1940, just after the balloon barrage had been put up, a small balloon barrage. And also there were fighters, Hurricane fighters. These are Hurricane Mark 1s, Squadron 245, that was based at Aldergrove. And they arrived in July 1940 from Edinburgh. They, however, were not equipped for night fighting. You see from their war diary that much of their time when they came here was to try and practice operating in nighttime conditions. In addition to that, there was very little evacuation of school children, women and school children. Something like 80,000 children are estimated to have been in Belfast when the Blitz started. Actually, it's, I think, literally the case to say that Belfast was better prepared for enemy invasion at the time of the Blitz than it was for aerial attack. Now that in many ways seems unlikely or improbable that Belfast should be under-protected. The Dockside in particular had long been regarded as the most vulnerable and likely target in Northern Ireland right from the 1920s. It is so easily located, Belfast at the head of the loch. So much of Belfast industry is concentrated at the head of the loch, again easily located, Harland Wolff, Shorten Harlands, the Harbour Power Station with 80,000 consumers, and not far away is Telephone House, the gasworks, 2 railway stations. So in other words, it was a vulnerable target and also an easily located target. And also by the time of the Blitz, it was an increasingly important, Belfast an increasingly important industrial centre, munitions centre, and also a base for troops. This is a photograph of the first Stirling built at Shorten Harlands, taken in October 1940, being brought to the runway. At the time of the Blitz, Shorten Harlands had something like 11,000 workers, Harland Wolff shipyards about 23,000 workers. So there was, for all these various reasons, it was reasonable to anticipate that Belfast would be attacked. And what made it a great deal more vulnerable was the fall of France in June 1940. As a consequence of that, the Admiralty diverted shipping from the southern ports of Great Britain, from the Channel to the western ports, to Liverpool, to Glasgow, and of course to Belfast. And also with the fall of France, of course, the consequence was that the Luftwaffe had bases in northern France as well as Holland. So therefore it had much easier, the Luftwaffe squadrons had much easier access to Belfast and could, for example, traverse up the coast of Eire to reach Belfast. They no longer required to cross over Great Britain. Why was Belfast underprepared and ill-defended? I mean, partly it's because at first certainly it was regarded as being too remote, too insignificant. Also it was felt it was very unlikely that the Luftwaffe would, especially in the early months of the war to June 1940, travel all the way across Britain and risk the anti-aircraft defences in Britain to reach Northern Ireland when there were better targets, it would seem, in Britain itself. Another thing was the long immunity from attack. Belfast had no areas whatsoever until April 41, whereas, for example, in the UK, elsewhere, for example, London, the Blitz had started September 1940. Another thing was the neutrality of Eire. There was a belief, certainly popularly accepted, that Hitler might accept the neutrality of Eire, recognise it, and as a consequence of that, refrain from attacking Northern Ireland. Overall, there was a much more relaxed atmosphere in Belfast. This photograph taken by the Belfast Telegraph, June 1940, shows not an unusual sight, familiar sight to those living in Belfast, of people sunbathing on a sunny afternoon. Very relaxed, casual atmosphere. British observers, whenever they saw this, one Tom Harrison, a professional observer, when he saw that, he commented that if people were to behave in that sort of relaxed, casual way in, say, Liverpool or Birmingham, they might cause a riot. In other words, just a very relaxed atmosphere. And you might feel perhaps that the political leadership of Northern Ireland has something to blame, or must bear some of the blame for lack of preparation, it's ageing, lacking in energy, lacking in imagination, etc. But you'd have to bear in mind that the key decisions about Belfast's defences and Northern Ireland's defences were made in Britain. They were decisions made in London. Even with regard to the building of shelters, the allocation of concrete, labour, of bricks, was something which was essentially determined by the London government. And they determined that the available resources, those resources, should be used to construct airfields to service bases in the Battle of the Atlantic. A further factor, looking at why Britain didn't apply or delegate or allocate more, say, guns, anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, etc., to Belfast and Northern Ireland, was simply the fact that they were in very short supply, and the defence experts who made the decisions about allocation, they determined where should these go to then, where would they allocate their anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, etc. And there were two main criteria which they used to determine or in making that decision. One was the likelihood of an area to be attacked. Now, Belfast had no raids right through to the spring of 1941, while somewhere like Liverpool already had almost 50 in 1940. So therefore it seemed reasonable to assume that Liverpool was more vulnerable than Belfast was. And also the other criterion was how important an area was to the war effort, how strategically important it was. And that was worked out by totalling up the number of key points in any given region or area. Key points, what was meant by that phrase was munitions factories, so many munitions factories, docks, oil stores, iron and steel plants, chemicals works, etc., etc. And they totaled it up. It wasn't a sort of ambiguous thing, they totaled it up with some precision. It was rated that Belfast had about 29 key points, Liverpool 230, according to their calculations. On the other hand, having said all of that, Belfast was unprepared for the reasons that we've gone through there. There was, particularly amongst government ministers and civil servants, a feeling that Belfast was very likely to be attacked, especially by late 1940, from late 1940 onwards. That related to the fact that Belfast was becoming more important gradually as an industrial producer, port, etc., etc. But also it was because of an awareness that the Luftwaffe were overhead in Belfast. And that was reflected in the fact that you have more and more red alerts in Belfast. October 1941, which was the first, 22nd of October, there were 20 on before the first action bombs fell in April 41. Also, the Luftwaffe were overhead. What were they doing up there? And one of the explanations was that they were carrying out reconnaissance. And these are two photographs which were taken by the Luftwaffe in late 1940. The one on the left shows Belfast with various key targets identified on the photograph. At the same time also you have the photograph on the right there of Derry. Again, the photograph taken at much the same sort of time. They were taking these reconnaissance photographs. Part of the purpose of that was to brief their U-boat commanders who are based in Brittany, pass on information about convoys in Belfast Lough or whatever. But also another reason they were there was to build up target files. In other words, build up just information about targets in Belfast in preparation for an attack. And that involved taking those photographs that were just shown. It involved also printing up these briefing papers for Luftwaffe crews when eventually they did attack Belfast. And they had, for example, these target folders which are held by the Imperial War Museum. It contained ordnance survey maps with the targets marked. They included these sorts of details here which highlighted the importance of the various targets, how well or how poorly they were defended. This particular one here relates to Harland Wolff and Short and Harlands, but there were similar ones for the power station, etc., etc. One peculiar one, in other words, they're gradually building up these target files in preparation to brief the Luftwaffe pilots and all the rest of it. And generally speaking, they're extremely accurate. Would have been very functional and serviceable. But one odd one is here. This is one of the target files produced in this period, 1940. And this is a target file for the waterworks, at least one of the inclusions in that target file. The odd thing about it is that it describes the waterworks as being the main waterworks for Belfast, which of course it had long since ceased to be. It had only been the main waterworks for Belfast somewhere around the 1850s. Long since it had been used exclusively for recreation. And it is an odd inclusion which may help to account for the Easter Tuesday raid and the distribution of damage then. There's one further reason why ministers and officials were more and more convinced that the attack in Belfast was sort of becoming more and more inevitable. And that was that the Luftwaffe from the early part of 1941 were focusing their attacks, their blitz, on the western ports, on Glasgow, on Liverpool. It was after one of the major raids in Glasgow in March 1941 that Lord McDermott, who was responsible for preparation for the blitz in Northern Ireland, he commented after the Clydeside raid mid-March 1941, he said, "The next full moon from, say, the 7th to the 16th of April may well bring our turn." And of course that was absolutely the case. But he wasn't alone in thinking that. That was a general conviction. The odd thing Knights feel is that in Belfast itself, amongst the ordinary people, the citizens of Belfast, there was no real expectation of a raid. There was still a sort of a presumption that really Belfast might very well get through without being attacked. And I think that was related to two things. One thing was that there were so many red alerts and nothing happened. You know, as I mentioned earlier, 20-odd red alerts, the sirens went off, no bombs. So that was reassuring. And the other thing was that basically in Belfast, the citizens, they had little idea of the scale of Luftwaffe activity over Belfast, or over Northern Ireland in general, because of press censorship. I could give many examples of that, but they had little or no knowledge of, for example, the fact that the Luftwaffe were mining Belfast Lough almost daily in July 1940, or the attacks on shipping in the Lough in Belfast, or that, for example, the Battle of the Atlantic was raging very close to the Irish coast, with 3 Allied ships being sunk daily in the 6 months from June through to December 1941. 1940. We now move on just to the first of the 4 raids. The first raid was the Dockside raid, 7th to 8th April 1941, often referred to as the Wee Raid, or the Dockside raid, which is more appropriate perhaps. It wasn't actually a wee raid, in the sense that it was one of the biggest raids on the UK of the war, of the Blitz. 500 bombers, many more bombers than were involved, for example, in the night of Easter Tuesday or the fire raid in May. 500 bombers left their bases in northern France, Holland, etc. To attack the UK, but only a very small number came to Belfast. 8 came to Belfast. Or at least, let's say that at most at any one time there were 8 in the skies above Belfast. And for a period of about 3.5 hours they bombed Belfast. Now it's hard to know what were they doing here in Belfast. Were they there by chance? It was bad weather over the UK. Did they stray to Belfast and just by chance happen to see Belfast and bomb Belfast? Or alternatively, was it a pre-planned raid? Was it actually, were they designated to attack Belfast? Pre-planned, sort of testing defences, etc. A sort of trial run for bigger raids. It's impossible to say, the German records don't make it clear. This is the only German record there is of the attack of Dockside raid. You can see at the top there, Kampf Group of 26. That was the squadron. And it's a very short report of the raid by Henkel 3 bomber crew. It gives the time of the arrival toward Belfast, what time they left at, what height they delivered their bombs from, what bombs they dropped, what they think was the impact of the bombs. And that was almost certainly the first aircraft to attack Belfast in the Blitz, the Belfast Blitz, that record. The interesting thing about it, Kampf Group 26 was an elite squadron, Pathfinder squadron. Their function was to reach targets first, the target for the raid first, set the targets alight, and then successive waves of bombers following on behind them would see the fires and bomb those targets. The fact that they were involved in this attack might suggest it was pre-planned, that they didn't just turn up by chance, by accident. The raid itself, certainly there was considerable damage to East Belfast. This is a photograph, no doubt many of you recognise, of St Patrick's Church, Church of Iron Church on the Newton Road. It was the worst fire in East Belfast of the night. Incendiary bombs set fire to the roof, which spread then to the gallery, the pews, floor, and really it was only the altar of the east wing of the church, the east window, which survived the raid intact. East Belfast was quite hard hit. Something that's estimated about 800 incendiary bombs were dropped on East Belfast, along the Barrage Road, Templeware Avenue, Albert Bridge Road, etc. It's estimated about 150 of them broke through the roofs of houses. In some cases, as many as 5 fell per house. Later reports by the Civil Defence Service commented on the magnificent performance of the local women, who smothered them as soon as they fell in many cases, and one old woman carrying out an incendiary bomb out onto the street with a pair of tongs. But nonetheless, East Belfast, a number of fires did erupt. For example, Belfast Fire Brigade, on the night of the Easter Tuesday of the Dockside raid, they dealt with 15 fires. They were called out to 15 fires. 9 of those were in the Newton Norris Road area. So there was the biggest number of fires was in the Newton Norris Road area, lower Newton Norris Road. One fireman, F.E. Watson, recalls how he was asked to back up the firemen at Albert Bridge Road Fire Station, and he was driving up the lower Newton Norris Road to get to the Albert Bridge, and he says, describes how he was stopped by local men who compelled him to put out the fires there with no option, he reported afterwards to his, those who he was serving. Anyway, the other areas hit, Templemore Avenue, Baz was hit, there was something, roof collapsed, fires broke out, etc., etc. But the worst incidence of fires was in the docks area. As I've said, it's normally referred to as being the Dockside raid. McHugh Dix and the premises around that, the timber yard, was the biggest fire of the night. They were still damping down the fires on the night of, or during the course of the 9th of April, 2 days later, there was still, the Belfast Fire Brigade was still active in that area. 12 civilians died in the course of the attack, and all of them in the dock area, which again justifies the description of it as being the Dockside raid. The most devastating incidents occurred in the last minutes of the attack. It's been described a last tantalising bomber swept over Belfast. But 3:30, very literally the last bomber, and he inflicted the worst damage of the night. We know something about him because he was interviewed by Trevor Allen, an historian, and his name was Siegfried Rothke, flying a Henkel. And he was over Belfast purely by chance. He was designated to attack Dumbarton, went there, so cloudy he couldn't see it really. He then flew down to Glasgow, again so cloudy, virtually it just felt it was impossible to bomb the city with any degree of accuracy. But he noticed out west that the skies were clear. And Luftwaffe commanders of his rank and experience had the discretion to divert, and he diverted. He diverted and decided to attack Belfast. He dropped 2 large parachute mines, 1,000 kilograms of explosives. The shelters in Belfast were designed to withstand bombs of 500, up to 500, and even in some instances weren't successful in doing that. One struck Ranks flour mill, causing 20 casualties, and the other struck Harland Wolff. It was described by some local servicemen in Belfast as being a lucky direct hit, and it was. I mean, you can see here, it caused very considerable damage. This is the Alexander Works at Harland Wolff, where they made fuselages for the shortened Harlands, and it was absolutely devastating. 4.5 acres destroyed. The casualties were higher than they ought really to have been, because some workers were in the shelters. They thought the raid was over, saw this parachute mine coming down, large grey, thing sketched, which they could see on the horizon, assumed it was a German crewman had bailed out, surged toward him to get him, basically, and unfortunately for them, it was actually a bomb which exploded, and that greatly increased the numbers of casualties. That's the Dockside raid. At 3:30 it was over, but it was always likely the Luftwaffe would return. There are 2 or 3 reasons for that presumption. One, for example, the rumours spread by Lord Hoho, who was reported as saying that there would be Easter eggs for Belfast. Also, the Luftwaffe were ominously, the Luftwaffe were continuing to devastate the western ports, Liverpool, Glasgow, etc., Bristol. So it seemed likely then Belfast would get its turn, as it were. And also the servicemen on in Belfast were reporting constant Luftwaffe activity. For example, the balloon barrage, the airmen who operated that, they reported on the night of the 10th, the night of the 11th, the night of the 12th, the night of the 13th, all those nights, Luftwaffe activity over Belfast. Nothing happened, but they were certainly aware of these and recorded these repeated sightings of Luftwaffe bombers over the area, over the city. Nothing much could be done to strengthen Belfast's defences before the Luftwaffe did return. One thing was searchlights were introduced on the 10th of April, and another thing was that the introduction of a smoke screen on the 11th of April. These were very crude machines which churned out smoke to try and conceal and obscure the dock area, the square mile of the docks. They weren't really regarded in Britain as being very effective, but they were felt to be good for morale. And even that might be doubted. Dorian Bates was a tax inspector who lived in Sydenham, and she describes how one of her neighbours, whenever she first saw this smoke machine, commented that she thought it was poison gas, and it certainly didn't help her morale. Also, local firms were encouraged to put up smoke. Like the rope works, for example, they were instructed by the government to emit as much smoke as they could from their factory chimneys. The Luftwaffe did return Easter Tuesday. Anybody who thinks about the Blitz or talks about the Blitz, almost always, inevitably or invariably, this is the raid which they think of, the first major raid in Belfast. Night of 15th, 16th April, 330 German bombers left their bases, and 180 of them attacked Belfast. So Belfast was the primary target, and over a period of about 4 hours, on 11:20, they dropped their bombs, 200 bombs, 30,000 incendiary bombs. Now there can be no doubt that North Belfast was the area which suffered most. This map clearly shows that. It's a map produced by Professor Frederick Bowl, and it just shows basically and crudely the main incidents based on government returns of casualties. Now, government returns, there are gaps in them, they're somewhat incomplete, and in some cases they're inaccurate, but unquestionably North Belfast was the area which suffered most. The streets that you think of when you think of the Blitz are certainly most people would think of, I think, would be Unity Street, Atlantic Avenue, Hillman Street, Annandale Street, Burke Street, Duncairn Gardens, North Belfast. Hogarth Street was the one street probably to suffer most. Hogarth Street alone, 80 people were killed, roughly 80 people were killed on this night. One of the, one of the targets which was hit, which was not reported, no photographs, certainly not in the Telegraph, of it, was this here, this Victoria Barracks, North Queen Street, military, of course, barracks. The Surrey Regiment was the main regiment based there, and it sustained 13 casualties. The dead were repatriated back to England, so you know very few people have been aware of that, aware of the extent of the casualties there. But most people would have been aware, on the other hand, of the other damage in North Belfast. I could show you hosts of photographs of various locations in North Belfast, but two of the best known. This is Atlantic Avenue, showing the remains of a shelter that was there, where 38 people were killed. In fact, it was quite a small bomb, according to government reports, but it caused total devastation. And another one which many people would have heard of is here. This is the it's a rear wall of the York Street flax spinning mill, which collapsed, 6-story high wall, collapsed onto houses on Clear Street, Sussex Street, and the consequence of that, this massive masonry cascading down, was that over 40 fatalities in those two streets, just pulverising the houses which were below them. And of course other instances. I mean, the difficulty of damage and casualties in North Belfast, it's difficult to say why North Belfast got it so hard. The docks virtually escaped. The docks was unquestionably the main target for the attack. But it was just 18, there were hundreds of people killed in this attack, just 18 in the dock area. It largely escaped. There's nothing, virtually very little military significance damaged. So it does seem difficult to understand how the docks by and large escaped, given the fact that it was so easy to locate, etc. And of course there is this speculation that it was because the Luftwaffe mistook the waterworks for the docks, and therefore they bombed the areas south and west of the waterworks. And that was a view expressed at the time by people in their diaries, etc., by eyewitnesses. And also, it was government officials also said that. There were government reports which came to that exactly that same conclusion. It's certainly easy to sort of say why the docks might have been missed. Look, there are good reasons. One would be that it was a very cloudy night. The Met Office, for example, at Sydenham, reported virtually total cloud cover, right through to about 3. A third of the Luftwaffe aircraft who, whenever they left their bases, were designated to attack Belfast. A third of them never made it, couldn't find it. And they bombed British, Liverpool particularly, British targets instead. A third of them was diverted. Another reason was that this was very strongly argued by military chiefs and by the management of the Short and Harlands, that it was because of the smoke screen. They said it was a smoke screen. The manager, Kemp, a man called Kemp at Short and Harlands, said he said that the aircraft factory was sealed by the smoke screen. And generally speaking, the service chiefs, military service chiefs in Belfast, fully accepted that. Thought there was a great deal of truth in that. And in fact, it was resented at the time. So Diarist, for example, a Diarist who commented that he said, the people here are saying, he said, it was cruel to put up a smoke screen over the docks, etc., as it meant that their houses were bombed. So in other words, there was something that people also thought something in that. Also, you have to bear in mind that Luftwaffe techniques were crude, their bombing techniques. They were trying to deliver their bombs by sight. It was cloudy, there was smoke, smoke screen was up, etc. Very difficult to reach any sort of degree of accuracy. Things like parachute bombs, parachute mines, how do you control where they land? But a further factor that again helps to explain why they missed the docks was the fact, well, I'll come on to just a further factor is that the docks was lucky. The docks were lucky. Now they did hit the docks. There's a photograph here which shows Harland Wolff. It's a boiler shop, electrical manufacturing shop, Queen's Works and the Harland Wolff. They did hit the shipyards and also hit Short and Harlands. 4 Sterlings were destroyed, for example. And there were some number of casualties, but 40 or so casualties amongst the workforce. But they were hit very early in the attack, about 11:35, at the very beginning of the attack. This damage was caused. And the docks were lucky in a sense, and so also was East Belfast, in the sense that many of the bombs that they dropped, unlike this one obviously, many of the bombs that they dropped failed to explode. There were 10 parachute mines, for example, after this attack, which were found just lying in the mud, hadn't exploded. And many people commented on that, the large number of what they were referred to as unexploded bombs, or UXBs. And another interesting feature of the docks was that the fires were very quickly extinguished. For example, at Harland Wolff, the fires were put out within about 30 minutes. And the consequence of that was that the Luftwaffe aircraft which came over, they went for where the fires were staying lit. In other words, the area north and west of the docks. It impacted, in other words, on the pattern of the rest of the attack. And that was very lucky for East Belfast because, as a government report states, something like 80% of the workforce of Harland Wolff lived within 2 miles of Harland Wolff. They were to be less lucky in the May raids, or less fortunate in the May raids. There's just one other thing I think before moving on to the May raids. There's one strong piece of evidence which suggests that the Luftwaffe didn't really mistake the waterworks for the docks. And that is, if you look at the reports which the Luftwaffe crews themselves wrote after the attack was over, and they went back home, their mission reports. And basically what they report is that they had caused fires, explosions and so on, but they went on and very often to say that the effect was not known. And their conclusion on the attack was that the raid was unsatisfactory, abortive, inconclusive. Only mediocre results could be expected. The effect of it was minimal. In other words, all of that would suggest that they knew full well that they'd missed the docks. They were not under no illusions at all. They just didn't know what they did. No idea. But it certainly gives the impression from those reports that they were clear that they hadn't hit the docks. As far as East Belfast itself is concerned, government reports at the time said that generally speaking the area was little affected. government reports praised local East Belfast ARP members, civil defence services and so on, praised them for, in their hundreds, going into other areas which had been badly affected, like North Belfast, to reinforce comrades, and had commented that the raid gave a terrific boost to recruitment to the civil defence services because people would rather be active at that time of the raid rather than just sitting around waiting to be hit. And it did apparently give a considerable lift to numbers of volunteers. Dorian Bates, tax inspector based in Sydenham, she gives a very vivid description of the attack and how she experienced it in Sydenham. And she comments that really basically that the distance, because of the distance, she was affected by the vibration, she could hear the bombs, etc. But she felt that because of the distance, there really wasn't that much damage done. She talks about she went to bed, the bed swayed like a cot because of the vibration. She went through poems in her head, she then went on to hymns and psalms, etc. But she went on to say at the end that it was amazing, after all that noise, to find not a tile off or window broken. And she talks about going into work next day. She said she had to go into a considerable distance into Belfast from her office to find the first windows broken. The bridges were okay, she was able to get a tram, she got into work okay. But she also commented that the posters in the centre of the town saying that water should be boiled on the County Antrim side, and she would want comments on that. Those on the north side clearly had worse than we had because they were having to boil their water. But East Belfast there was certainly some damage to East Belfast. At Sydenham Airport, an RAF man reported saying, you know, gas mains damaged and plumes of he said that the gas mains were fractured and the fire which resulted from that was like an enormous blow lamp. Templemore Avenue Hospital was hit. Patients subsequently were evacuated from the hospital, the Ulster Hospital in other words. The worst single incident was Thorndike Street, where bombs fell, 20 people were killed, 14 of them in a shelter. One who'd been Robert Wary reported to a coroner's inquest after the raid. He said that he described how he'd been in the shelter, and in the course of the raid he felt tired. He felt, I'll go home to bed. Reached home, went to bed. No sooner had he done so than there was a massive bomb explosion and blown out of bed. At the end of the raid, he went back to the shelter to find that all these people had been killed, including his father, his mother, 3 sisters, a brother. Mary Wallace, who was a child in Bloomfield, glanced up during the course of the raid, glanced through a window, and she says, the sky was red, pure red. You'd have thought someone had set fire to the world. So there certainly was damage on East Belfast, but nothing comparable really to North Belfast. Elsewhere in the city, again, city centre largely escaped. South Belfast largely escaped damage. Blythe Street, one exception to that. West Belfast did have considerable damage caused there. Ohio Street, Heather Street, you'll have seen photographs of Wilton's funeral service, the property there. Percy Street, of course. A turning point in the raid was somewhere around 1:45. According to government reports, at that point the fires went out of control, and progressively the government called in aid from elsewhere in Northern Ireland to help put out the fires, from Britain and of course from the Republic. And this is the occurrences book for Drogheda, just recording the fact that the firemen from Drogheda went up to Belfast, and the other photograph is some of the firemen who went up from Drogheda to help with the fires. In addition to, I should say, the bombs damaged in Belfast, there were bombs dropped in Nards and Bangor and Derry, and all of that's described in detail in the book. 2 features of the attack were, one, the very high death rate. Something like 740 civilians lost their lives. And this is the cemetery, Milltown Cemetery, showing a memorial there to its victims. The 740 civilian lives were lost. The photograph on the right is of Eglinton Street. That figure, 740, doesn't include military deaths. And a number of military casualties resulted from the bombing of Eglinton Street. The Presbyterian Church was used as a billets there by troops. Considerable casualties there. And of course in Victoria Barracks, in Newton Ards there were military deaths. So in other words, the death rate in total was significantly greater than the 740. The death rate was high because so many bombs had dropped and fallen on terraces, working class terraces, which provided no defence or protection against the bombs, no effective protection. This is an extract from the St Patrick's Catholic Church in Donegal Street. It's the register of burials. Just an extract of the register of burials. Over 30 burials from Sussex Street and Vere Street, where York Street Mill had cascaded onto these houses, killed this list of people, over 30. So there's just the distribution of the attack, which certainly contributed to the high level of mortality. Other reasons would be the fact that shelters were too few and underutilised. So few people had evacuated from the city. Half of those who died were women and children. Also, the fact that the defences were inadequate. Belfast was poorly defended. A reason why it was poorly defended was at 1:45, Telephone House was damaged. This photograph on the left is of Cromick Square, East Bridge Street area. And it was those bombs in precisely that area, which caused damage to the Telephone House. The damage to the Telephone House resulted in the anti-aircraft gunners not being able to get their signals through from their control room. So therefore they had no idea, they weren't getting information anymore, but the position of Luftwaffe bombers, their height, their speed, their flight path. And they were given orders at 1:45, 2 o'clock, just to stop firing. So there was literally Belfast was totally undefended, really, effectively, from that moment. The photograph on the right is of the HMS Furious. It's often stated that it helped defend Belfast. It was in Victoria. That photograph was taken just off Larne just before the Second World War started. It's a 22,500 ton aircraft carrier. It was in for repair at Victoria Wharf. The commander of the ship wrote a report after the Easter Tuesday attack. He wrote a report to the Admiralty, Commander Lang, 17th of April, and he says that the ship's armament was urged to augment the shore defences, in other words, help with the anti-aircraft guns. But he said that just one barrage was fired, as the guns could not be brought to bear. So in this raid, the Furious was pretty much inactive in the course of the raid. The other thing which was striking about the attack was, of course, the high level of evacuation. Something like 100,000 people got out of Belfast immediately, even during the raid, in the instant after it, 100,000 by the end of April. In fear and panic. At the same time, also thousands ditched. In other words, didn't leave Belfast permanently, but went to the suburbs, the parks, slept out overnight, and came back whenever the hours of darkness was over, and they felt there was no risk of a blitz. Some areas were avoided. In Hollywood Road, for example, people didn't tend to walk past Sydenham Airport. There were other sort of areas like that in Belfast. Overall, Dorian Bates, who I mentioned there, was a tax inspector, lived in Sydenham. She had lived in London for 6 months. She came to Belfast in March 1941, and reflecting back, she had 6 months of blitz in London. She said that the Easter Tuesday raid was the worst raid I've had. It was worse than London, because Belfast is a smaller place. One feels more part of the target. So she felt it was her worst night. Again, it was likely the Luftwaffe would be back. Lord Haw said they'd just give them Belfast people time to bury their dead. Luftwaffe knew they hadn't hit the targets they'd intended to hit, so therefore Belfast would remain high on their list. The western ports were still being pulverised by the Luftwaffe, so it was likely they would return. Not much could be done in the meantime to strengthen Belfast's defences. Two things were done. There was a small increase in the number of anti-aircraft guns, from 22 it went up to 28, and the dangerous animals in Belfast Zoo were put down. 32 animals in Bellevue were put down, apparently because of pressure from local people living in the area. The final raids, just briefly to discuss those. The last major raid in Belfast was 4th 5th May 1941. Lasted for 3 hours, from about 1 o'clock. It was a bigger raid. 200 bombers, 200 tons of bombs of high explosives dropped, 100,000 incendiaries, massive number of incendiaries. That's why it's so often referred to as being the fire raid. You know, it was more intense, it was shorter than the Easter Tuesday raid was. And in this raid, from the very outset, the dock area was pulverised. They got their targets. It was the east of Belfast, the centre of Belfast, and to some extent the north of Belfast, which were the areas which suffered most. Harland Wolff here, attacked by groups of about 5 aircraft at a time. Musgrave, Victoria, Abercorn, Queen's works into the areas most affected. 40 ships were listed as having been damaged or destroyed in the course of the attack. 2/3 of the premises were listed as being destroyed in the course of the attack. It was the worst hit yard anywhere in the UK during the Blitz. £2 million claimed at the end of it, submitted by Harland Wolff. Output didn't fully recover until November 1941. At the same time, also Shorten Harlands was hit, and output and production was disrupted. A big problem for Shorten Harlands wasn't just the damage to its own main factory at Shorts, but again the Alexander works at Harland Wolff was hit, which produced fuselages for the Shorts. And also another thing was the offices. It was Kemp, who was the W.P. Kemp, who was the director of the firm, described the production offices as being the brain centre. The drawings were held there, their records, their schedules. And he's regarded as being a major blow to output production at Shorten Harlands. Elsewhere in East Belfast also, on this occasion, damage occurred and considerable numbers of casualties resulted. One of the main naval, the head of the Navy in Belfast, Royal Navy in Belfast, said that acres of the shipyard were consumed by fire, which also cascaded into the densely populated Newtonards Road. And to give just some examples, Dorian Bates also said that. He said, our side of the river got it this time, whilst the other side got it on Easter Tuesday. And just to give some examples briefly here, that's the Templemore Avenue Hospital. A consultant there said, one had not time to remove one's steel helmet to adjust the chin strap before another bomb fell. The hospital itself, as you can see, was hit. Fortunately, the patients had been evacuated after Easter Tuesday, so there was no patient loss of life. The Templemore Avenue Baz also hit. This gives you, I think, a very clear impression of the damage in East Belfast. The area looking toward St Patrick's Church, and just a clear insight into the scale of the devastation. One lady who lived in this area wrote a letter on the 13th of May, and she said in the letter, we are still living all well, but it's only God's blessing that has kept us here. She describes the incendiary bombs, etc., the devastation of houses and so on. She talks about a gas main being struck and the resulting flames were higher than the house from it. She says whenever they emerged from the shelter we all came out, and she said it was like a picture of hell. You could see nothing but flames. The whole of the town seemed to be on fire. Also, the church across the street, St Matthew's, the chronicle for St Matthew's describes this parachute mine which had caused this crater. Very, very lucky the church to have survived. 3 incendiary bombs hit the church which were extinguished. But the St Matthew's Chronicle states that the streets about St Matthew's were wiped out. Sorry, the streets above St Matthew's were wiped out, many killed, many about Middlepass Street, Foundry Street lost their homes, etc., etc. I mean, amongst the streets which were damaged, there's Taylor Street, but you can go through a list of them: Withen Street, Crystal Street, Tower Street, Westcott Street, Hornby Street, Skipper Street, Carew Street, Bryson Street, Mersey Street, Westmount Street, Donegal Street, etc., etc. This is the photograph, as I said, of Taylor Street. Another was this photograph, very well known, of the photograph of Westbourne Street. 15 people were killed, 65 houses it's estimated were damaged or destroyed. It wasn't until the 25th of May, 3 weeks more or less after this attack, that the soldiers felt that they'd recovered all the bodies that were to be rescued from there, partly because of an unexploded bomb which delayed operations. Also, the Belfast and County Railway was struck. The ropeworks was hit. The ropeworks, the directors were informed at the ropeworks that the sprinkler system at the ropeworks would work really well until the pressure in the mains failed, at which point the ropeworks again were extensively damaged. And this shows this Crystal Street off Ravenscroft Avenue, again showing some of the damage. And the next one of the Hollywood Arches, instantly recognisable. Again, the railway line, lucky to escape. Eric Rogers was a child walking through this area just after the May raid. And he talked about walking along, negotiating hoses and debris, stumbling, climbing, feeling our way, keeping away from hotter fires, and precariously damaged remains of buildings, skirting bomb craters, etc. He talks about one place, a huge brick wall collapsed. It was the wall of the ropeworks, as if pushed over in one long sheet by a giant hand. He comments that he saw, and I'm quoting here, tired, dishevelled men and women working amid the devastation, some crying as they toiled. But he went on to say it was the silent crying of onlookers which caused him the greatest shock. Other places damaged: the Oval football ground, well described in Roy Francis' book. Also the further out than that, the Belmont Road, for example, and Stormont. After there was some bombs that fell in Stormont, one of them fell at the base of Carson's statue, which more or less caused the Prime Minister, Johnny Andrews, panic. He made phone calls, he set up a cabinet committee. Should they move the statue? He consulted Carson's widow, what should we do with this, etc. Eventually it was decided just to leave the statue where it was, because the sculptor told him that he had a cast of the head, so therefore it was kept where it was. But it was decided to blacken the walls of Stormont. It was felt Stormont was a sort of target, so obvious and stood out so much on the horizon. At the same time also, it was felt maybe it could be used as something to identify the position of other targets from, so it was decided to leave it there. Doreen Bates describes in her account in Sydenham the gas going off, the ceilings coming down, windows being blown in, etc., etc., and these vibrations of bombs which she heard. Amongst the bombs she would have heard were these bombs at Campbell College. Campbell had been being used as a military hospital from July 1940 to October 1945. An unbelievable 34,000 soldiers were treated in those years in Campbell. It suffered in this raid. Different huts on the left were blown up, and what's called the North Block caught fire. 13 fatalities. So that was certainly, for the military, the worst single episode of the night. As well as that, in East Belfast, the gas was off for about a week. Water had to be boiled after this attack. Main roads were closed, like the Hollywood Road and the Barrage Road. But it was the main city centre of the city which also experienced major damage. I could show you scores of photographs of this, but Bridge Street, you can see there before, just about 1939, and after the attack, the only building ready to survive in Bridge Street was the Northern Whig office, but it also was gutted, but it survived. And there's High Street before and after again, showing the scale of the devastation. North Belfast also suffered. York Street Mill was struck again, the LMS station, and so on, Gallagher's tobacco factory, etc. And again, other areas of North Belfast, Greencastle, etc. Again, the fires were something like 200 fires by the end of the attack. And again, the Northern Ireland government summoned aid from ERA, from 220, and the raid was still in progress from within Northern Ireland and from elsewhere in the United Kingdom. In East Belfast, it was Major G. Thompson who was the late main civil defence officer, and he sort of gave us a report after it. He talked about after the attack in some of the parts of the Lower North Road, women and men tearing into the debris with their bare hands to rescue the buried, because of the lack of equipment and nothing else to use. But he did say that the first aid posts were generally less busy than he had expected. He criticised the fact that whatever morgue facilities were available were closed during the attack, and bodies had to be left lying in the streets to the detriment of morale. Eyewitnesses described bodies lying outside Templemore Avenue, Baths, for example. After this attack, the corporation decided that perhaps they should have a morgue, a big morgue like St George's was in the north of the river. You know, so in preparation for future raids, there'd be some sort of similar facility available on the County Down side. Death rate was generally lower. There was something like 192 people lost their lives in this attack. Lower because so many of the bombs and incendiaries had fallen on commercial and industrial property. It was a Sunday night, 4th, 5th May, fewer people about in the city centre and dock area. After the Easter Tuesday raid, fewer people were working night shifts, so there were no deaths, according to government reports, in either Shorten Harlands or Harlan Wolf, even though they had been very severely damaged in both cases. At the same time, the defences were stronger, more active. The anti-aircraft guns, the Hms Furious. Perhaps people were more shelter conscious and took more use of the shelters. Certainly a definite factor was the fact that so many had evacuated from the city. Whenever the raid took place, 100,000 fewer people were there than had been there at the time of the Easter Tuesday raid. After this May raid, there was a further diaspora of people, just massive exodus, crashed evacuation out of Belfast. Civil servants estimated that by the end of May, the 220,000 of the population of Belfast had left. So that's obviously something approaching half the population. There was one last raid, and the very next night, 5th, 6th May, Ravenscroft Avenue, 3 bombers, Luftwaffe bombers, attacked. It was quite a big raid in the UK, but just 3 of them came to Belfast. It almost certainly was a deliberate attack. German sources referred to this raid as being a nuisance attack, or a nuisance sortie. It was just simply to further hit morale in Belfast, to disrupt the work of the civil defence services after the big raid, the fire raid. So it was almost certainly a pre-planned attack resulting from those causes. 2 shelters were hit in Ravenscroft Avenue, 40 occupants killed, 40 injured, 300 made homeless. You can just see there the hopelessness of the shelters, given the size of the crater. At the time, Belfast was so lucky, really, that this wasn't a major attack. Just 3 bombers came over out of 200. Belfast was so vulnerable at that moment, just at that moment in time. During that course of that night, fire crews, utterly exhausted, had been working 24-hour shifts virtually from the fire raid, exhausted by the following night. 3/4 of the city was without water, no water to fight fires if the fires had broken out. Many parts of the city, the water wasn't back until the 9th of May. The Furious had left in the course of just within hours of the end of the fire raid, and just hours before this raid. The Furious had trekked up the Belfast Loch, left Victoria Wharf at 6:30 in the evening. So in other words, Belfast was very exposed. And the other thing was actually that the electricity was off over much of the city. At the end of the fire raid, Dorian Bates and Sydenham commented, the sirens didn't go off. There was nothing to tell us that the raid was over. Also heard with handbells. And that's because the electricity was down. So in other words, the government ministers were worrying, well, how would they alert people to an area with the sirens out of operation? Anyway, that was basically the end of the Blitz as far as Northern Ireland was concerned. There was a small attack in Dublin. That was really the end of the Blitz as far as Northern Ireland was concerned. Just one or two final comments in a couple of minutes. After the fire raid, Belfast hit the headlines in the German media. A lot of German reporters and correspondents were on the Luftwaffe aircraft. 6 radio reporters, for example, on the aircraft which came over on the night of the fire raid. And the other, Mucke Beobachter, was the Nazi newspaper from 1920. Headlines of Belfast. All of them stated that Belfast had been pulverised. They'd never built ships or aircraft again. In fact, really, Belfast recovered quite quickly. The firms did recover. I mean, even you can see in this photograph here of Harlan Wolff that some buildings did remain intact. Firms were getting more and more orders by 1941. Shelter construction, people were getting jobs in shelter construction. Numbers were joined the army, were transferred to work in Britain, or serviced the troops in Belfast. In Northern Ireland, 100,000 British troops and subsequently 120 troops from the United States. The last couple of photographs here, just to perhaps cheer us up a bit, the VE Day celebrations, the 8th of May, the biggest numbers of people outside the City Hall it was claimed since Covenant Day in September 1912. But also it was a time for reflection and for thought and for prayer. These are soldiers in St Anne's Cathedral on VE Day, reflecting no doubt on the fact that the war was still continuing, as we were well aware in the last few days, with the war continuing in Japan, reflecting also no doubt on the loss of comrades and the numbers that died in Belfast, perhaps also thinking about their worries for the future. Overall, just a last comment, Belfast had far fewer raids than most major cities in Britain. Liverpool had over 70, Belfast had 4. But 2 in Belfast were particularly severe. In a table compiled by the weight of bombs dropped, Belfast comes 12th of UK cities. Compiled by the weight of bombs dropped, Belfast comes 12th. It lost about half its houses. Its 56,000 houses were destroyed or damaged. Half of its schools, public elementary schools. This Mersey Street, of course, hit by fire, 250 pupils there at the time. Roughly half the public elementary schools were destroyed. In fact, slightly over half. But of course the biggest loss was the loss of life. The raids had caused, 2 big raids predominantly had caused the death of something like 960 civilians. And this is the memorial of Belfast City Cemetery to the unidentified victims of the Blitz. 960 civilians, but that understates the numbers who died. It doesn't include the military deaths, and you go through it at Victoria Barracks, at Islington Street, Newton Ards, at Campbell. There were 17,000 British troops in Belfast at the time of the raids, of the air raids. So in other words, the figure is almost certainly something like 1,050, perhaps. That's a number. As Jimmy Doherty said, a warden at the time in his book, Post 381, he said, instead of the Blitz, it was the most disastrous event in the history of the city. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that observation. Thanks very much for listening to me.